Hey, this is Blue Nautilus from Seaside Modular, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate the Proteus generative sequencer module for VCV Rack. This is the 2.2 version of the module I'm demonstrating. If you're interested in what's new in this version, you can use the chapter headers to jump ahead to the What's New section. So what Proteus does is it generates melodies. It's going to generate a melody and then repeat that melody for a while. While it's repeating the melody, it can transpose that melody up or down an octave or two, depending on your settings. And it can mutate notes every once in a while, if you wanted to. Every once in a while, Proteus will change melodies. When it decides to change is something we'll talk about. I'm going to slow down our sequence here so we can get into this. And before we get started, I just want to describe exactly how this is patched up. It's very simple. We have a clock coming in to the clock input of Proteus. I have pitch information, the volt per octave output, going into the Platts-like macro oscillator up here. And I have the gate out into an envelope. Up here on the top of the rack, I just have a couple of LFOs from the Oct modulating the macro oscillator. And it's going through a little bit of a reverb. And that's basically it. We're going to talk about this later on. This is just here so I can send some trigger pulses in when we start to talk about the inputs. So the first thing to notice on Proteus are the lights. As Proteus steps through a sequence, the lights move from left to right. The green light indicates the first step of a sequence. So right now we're looking at a 16-step sequence, and so every 16 steps you'll see that green light. To change the length of the sequence, you can just use the length knob right here. I'm going to shorten it to 8 beats. And now we'll see that green light every 8 beats. Those white lights flashing means that Proteus has generated a new melody. And when a new melody is first generated, you'll notice that the lights are dim. Each time the melody repeats, the lights get a little bit brighter, and the brightness of the lights indicates the probability of a new melody being generated. That probability increases over time and is affected by this lambda parameter. So right now lambda is set to 20, and what that means is that after 20 repeats, there'll be about a 50% chance of Proteus generating a new melody. Now, it's not a linear increase from 0 to 50. The way this probability function works is that it stays low for a while, so you're pretty much guaranteed to have the melody repeat a number of times, and then as you approach lambda, the probability starts to shoot up. So after 20 repeats, the probability will continue to climb, and you're very unlikely to get very many more than lambda number of repeats. So if you want your melodies to repeat more times, you can increase this lambda parameter. If you want Proteus to change melodies more often, you can decrease it. If you want to force Proteus to generate a new melody, you can manually click this button right in the center. That's the new sequence button. The density knob controls the probability of rest notes. So right now we have density set to 100%, which means that every note is filled in. We're going to hear a note on every step. But as we decrease that density percentage, notes will start to disappear. So I'm going to turn it down to 50%. And I'm going to lock this melody right now by moving the mode over to the lock position. I'll explain that in detail a little bit later. So when the density is set to 50%, that means we're going to hear half the notes. These changes are made dynamically as you move the knob, so as I increase density, the notes will fill in. And the notes will fill in and disappear in the same order, which means if I turn the knob up to 100% and then turn it back down to 50%, we're going to end up with the same set of notes that we had when we were at 50% before. If you decrease the density all the way down to the minimum 1%, you're always going to have at least one note playing. Proteus will never go completely silent. The scale knob controls the scale that the notes are drawn from. So you have a number of options here, from a major scale to a couple of different minor scales. They have the natural minor, the harmonic minor. We have a major pentatonic, minor pentatonic, Dorian, Mixolydian, and all the way to the right we have a full chromatic mode where any semitone could be selected. Let's turn this to something that shows the difference. And that, sorry about the scrolling there, the scale changes will only take effect when there's a new melody. So I'm going to click the new melody button, give us a new melody, and now we can hear the different scale. The octave knob controls the probability of an octave transposition. So right now it's at 50%. I'm going to turn it up so we can get octave transpositions happening every time. This octave transposition is limited by the range that we have selected with the range selector. So right now I have octave range 1, and what that means is that Proteus could transpose up or down 1 octave from its base octave, which is the 4th octave. If I switch this to 2, it allows the octave range to go 2 octaves up or down from our bass, and if I switch this to 0, there's not going to be any octave transpositions. So octave range 0 is equivalent to turning this knob all the way to 0. There's 2 ways to do that. This mutate knob controls the probability of a single note changing after each repeat. So if we turn that up, we'll hear the melody mutate a little bit each time. Now, there is a menu option that affects how the mutation works, and so I'm going to show you that now. By default, the mutations will only occur within the base octave, so you're not going to get new notes that are outside the octave range of the initial sequence. But if you want the mutations to be able to jump octaves, you can set the mutation can transpose notes by octave to on. I guess I had it set to on. And if you turn that on, the new notes can be within the range set by your range slider here. Let's make this go a little bit faster again. The gate length is controlled by this knob here. So if we want longer notes, turn that up. This gate is proportional to the time between triggers. So at noon, it'll take up about half of the trigger to trigger time. The mode slider allows you to lock a sequence that you like. So in mode 0, the melody is free to change according to the probability function, and we're also free to transpose by octave and to mutate notes. If you slide this over to mode 1, you'll notice the lights change color to a pinkish color now. And this means that the melody is partially locked. So Proteus is not going to generate a new melody. However, in mode 1, it still can transpose the melody by octave and it can still mutate it. If we shift this all the way over to the right, the melody is fully locked and we get this yellow color, and that means there are going to be no changes at all. The melody is just going to repeat as is ad infinitum. Let's get a little bit of delay going in there. Okay, let's talk about the inputs. So first, the reset input at the bottom, the reset input will just return the sequence to the first step. It doesn't make a new sequence, just returns us to step 1. So right now I have this trigger, which is going to allow me to send a trigger whenever I click the button here into the reset input, just to show you how that works. So just going to click it a few times. We also have the new sequence input. So this is going to generate a new sequence when we send in a trigger. It's just like pressing the button, but you can do it with a trigger. We can also lock the sequence with this input here. Now, the behavior of the lock input depends upon a menu option. Lock CV in behavior, which has 3 options. By default, Proteus is set to 0-2 mode, and that means that a trigger is going to toggle us back and forth between mode 0 and mode 2, which is fully locked. So we'll go from unlocked to completely locked. So if I have Proteus running and I send a trigger in to the lock, it's going to lock us up and the melody will be fixed. And then we can unlock it with another trigger. Zero 1 allows us to toggle between the 0 mode fully open and 1 semi-locked, and 0-1-2 mode allows us to toggle to cycle through the different modes with a trigger pulse like that. The last mode is called high-low, and that is just going to be kind of like 0-2 mode, except it uses a gate where whenever the input is low, we're going to be fully open, and whenever the input is high, for as long as that input is high, Proteus will stay fully locked. So I'm just going to hold the gate down now, and we stay locked until I release it. The other inputs are just CV controls over the parameters that they describe. So for example, if we want to take this LFO up here and put it into the density input, we'll hear the sequence change in density as the LFO goes up and down. You can see it on the scope there. Okay, so what's new? If you're coming from the last version of Proteus 2.1, one of the changes is how the density knob works. So in the previous version, density affected the probability that each note was a rest, and now instead it affects the proportion of notes that are rests across the whole sequence. And what that means is that whenever the density knob is at 50%, you're guaranteed to always have half of the notes active. And the other consequence of this is that when we lower density all the way, we will always have at least one note. So you're not going to end up with completely empty sequences anymore when your density is low. The other thing about the way density works is that it now removes and fills in notes in order. That means each time there's a new sequence, there's also a new note removal order, and that means that if we change the density knob up and down, we're going to end up revisiting the same sequences. So if you like the melody you have at 50%, and you increase the density, when you come back down to 50%, you'll end up with the same melody. The other big change is that instead of a scale input, which wasn't particularly useful, we now have a lock input that allows you to change the lock mode with CVN. And that is controlled, or it is governed by a menu option that locks CV in behavior here that has a bunch of different options for how you can change the CV with an input. So either it toggles between fully open and fully locked. That's the 0-2 mode, meaning it toggles between 0 and 2 every time there's a trigger. Or it can toggle between 0 and 1 every time there's a trigger in. So we toggle from being fully open to being locking the melody but allowing octave and mutations. Or in the third mode, you can cycle through the different options with a trigger, like this. And if you don't simply want to use triggers to notify Proteus when to shift, you can use the high-low mode, which will lock Proteus completely anytime the voltage is high on this input. So as long as we keep the voltage high here, I'm holding down the button, Proteus will remain locked, and when the voltage goes low, it will open up. The other new option in the menu here is this Mutation can transpose notes by octave. If you turn that on, mutated notes, the new notes that the mutate procedure creates, don't have to be in the same octave as the initial sequence. They can float away, they can vary from that base octave by a range that is constrained by the range knob. So right now I have the range setting set to 1. It means my new mutated notes could be an octave up or down from my sequence and not necessarily within the same octave. That's all. Hope you enjoy this module.